and 95% of America is deficient in fiber. And, plant-based food contains other nutrients like polyphenols that you've talked a lot about, and they're massively beneficial to us. And most people don't realize that those polyphenols, things like quercetin, resveratrol, curcumin, come into contact with your microbiome, and that's how we ultimately get access to them. And it will produce more short-chain fatty acids. There's an efficiency that results from those polyphenols. So there's actually some interesting stuff with extra virgin olive oil and the impact that it has on the microbiome that's, you could argue, is prebiotic.
Welcome to the Mind-Gut Conversation. In this episode, I'm joined by Will Bulsiewicz, a board-certified gastroenterologist, New York Times bestselling author of Fiber Fueled and the Fiber Fueled Cookbook, and one of the leading physician voices shaping how we think about our gut health today. Known to many as Dr. B, Will brings 2 decades of clinical experience and a deep grounding in microbiome science to his work. He currently serves as U.S. Medical Director for the personalized nutrition company Zoe and is the founder of 38 Terra, all while continuing to challenge outdated ideas about diet, inflammation, and chronic disease. In today's conversation, we focus on his newest book, Plant-Powered Plus, and the broader evolution of gut health science from fiber and microbial diversity to immune activation, chronic inflammation, and the growing mismatch between modern lifestyles and human biology. We explore what inflammation really is, how the gut microbiome and immune system interact, and why restoring health requires more than just targeting symptoms. It requires rethinking how we live, eat, and connect. This is a wide-ranging, thoughtful discussion that blends science, clinical insight, and lived experience, offering practical perspectives on how small, sustainable changes can meaningfully improve long-term health. Will, welcome to the show.
Yes, Will, it's a great pleasure to have you here at our home and spend a whole hour picking your brain about the latest thing that has come out of your productive enterprise, Plant-Powered Plus.
Yeah.
And it's not even available yet, but I think by the time, when do you think a book will?
So the book will be published January 13th.
Okay.
And no, thank you, because, well, first of all, I told my wife that I was coming to your home for dinner, and my wife, of all the things that I've done recently, this was the one that she was most excited about. Was, wow, that's like really tremendous that you get to have dinner with Emeran Mayer. And, also, I just first want to start by acknowledging that you have been such an inspiration to me throughout my career. This far predates me writing books or having a platform or these conversations that we're about to have, and goes all the way back to when I was a medical trainee and trying to figure out what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And it's people like you that have inspired me throughout my career, and also the way in which you have not been scared to take risks when it comes to the brain gut. You remind me a lot, not the same, but you remind me a lot of one of my mentors, Doug Drossman, because when you step outside of the traditional box, people initially push back against it, but eventually they lift you up and say you're a hero. So thankfully, I think we're in that phase now.
Yeah, and it's an interesting phase for me personally. I mean, I don't want to talk about myself, but having this conversation with you and getting hearing these nice words from you means a lot to me. It's actually the best reward for what I've done in my career, to hear this from former students and trainees, and it had quite an influence despite the initial tremendous resistance. It's hard to believe today that even only 10 years later, it took 10 years for this to really sink in and become, as popular as you can imagine. And it's nice to have you here, because you clearly one of the people that I admire the most, because the side effects of this development of gut health and brain gut health. So the negative side of this is clearly that a lot of people jumped on this bandwagon that should not be talking. They have not the background, they have not the training, and many of them are snake oil sellers, that jump on this bandwagon. So it's nice to talk to somebody who actually has studied it, has taught it, is an expert in it, and is ethical, which is, almost, I shouldn't say rare, but it's not the norm in this.
Well, and I don't want to spend too much time on that because I think the listeners and viewers are going to get the most value from you and us back and forth discussing these different topics. So it's not just really about me, it's both of us. But what I will say is that if your dream is to be a medical doctor that impacts the lives of people in a beneficial way, which is where I came from, and I believe that's where you came from, then that's a mission-driven thing. And if you deviate from that mission, that's on you, and that's you'll make more money. But at the same time, I think that having a purpose and aligning with that purpose is actually the most satisfying thing that a person can do during their career.
Very wise words, I mean, I think the older I get, the more I realize the value of this philosophy. Some very wise people have written about it, have taught about it. Purpose seems to be one of the most important things. Talk a lot about longevity, healthy longevity. Having a purpose-driven life and career is clearly a big factor.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the unfortunate challenges these days, Emeran, in our healthcare system is that many of the doctors out there are struggling. And I think that part of what they're struggling with is a system that's pulling them away from their purpose. So what they signed up for was to have a relationship with patients and to help those patients. And what they feel like is they're just serving a system that wants to make as much money as possible. So it's created this conflict, and that's what physician burnout is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so let's jump into. I've read your book. I only had had a week to read it, but it was definitely exciting enough and stimulating enough that I managed to do this. And so I was going to ask you a few questions related to. So, like, the focus of your new book is somewhat different. I mean, there's clearly overlaps or continuation, but it shifted really from your initial focus on fiber. Fiber Fueled was the title of your first book. It was about fiber and diet and health. Now you've somehow pivoted to an emphasis on inflammation, immune system activation, which is obviously related to the first topic. But I just want to ask you a simple question. What is inflammation? It's overly used today.
Is that a simple question?
Everybody talks about inflammation.
Everyone talks about inflammation. Yeah.
Inflammatory food. So what is inflammation?
Well, I think the simple answer is that we have these defense systems that are in place to protect our body when we need them. Like if you're going to have an infection, or if you sustain bodily injury, a wound that needs to be healed, we have a system in place to address those issues and protect us. And that is the immune system. And we can get into more detail of like the different compartments of the immune system and how it all works. There, as you know, there's endless complexity, but we can also on some level simplify it and make it very understandable to the audience. But to me, inflammation is the activation of the immune system. And when that immune system is getting activated to fight a pathogen or to heal a wound, that's acute inflammation. It serves a good purpose and it helps us, and then it ends. But the issue that we have in the 21st century is not that. The issue that we have where inflammation that should be our friend has become the foe, and I would argue contributory to the vast majority of diseases that we're struggling with in our society. The reason that this has taken place is due to something slightly different, which is chronic, low-grade inflammation. And the chronic and low-grade inflammation is basically the perpetual, never-ending activation of the immune system on a lower level than like that acute inflammation to fight an infection. So like you don't get a fever, but it could manifest throughout your body with a headache, difficulty concentrating, ADHD, or brain fog, or stuffy nose, skin issues, breakouts, joint issues, musculoskeletal discomfort, or not feeling well. Obviously, digestive symptoms, bloating would be a common symptom. But if there's only one symptom that I can attribute to inflammation, it's fatigue. And we see this. I think everyone has experienced where you get a cold and you're tired. And in our patients who have these complex chronic inflammatory conditions like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, they all complain of fatigue. But on a lower level in our society, like there wouldn't be a market for Red Bull and for Monster energy drinks. That's so profound. There wouldn't be such a market for people to do things to address fatigue if this weren't a big problem. And, a few quick statistics. The World Health Organization calls inflammation the #1 threat of our time. The reason they do that is because 3 out of 5 causes of death are inflammatory health conditions. As I was researching this book, I asked the question, how many conditions, if I sit across from Emeran Mayer and have to show him the studies, how many conditions can I validate are associated with inflammation? I found over 130. And so 10% of America has an autoimmune condition and 30% of America has an allergic condition. Those are on the range of tens of millions up to over 100 million different people deal with these issues, not to mention obesity and metabolic problems. And I think the point, Emeran, is that this is such a pervasive, widespread problem. And the reason why it's so pervasive and widespread is because our environment has changed relative to the environment that you grew up in, that your parents and your grandparents grew up in. And this new environment is not in alignment with our biology.
Yeah, this is a point that that I like to emphasize as well. It's this mismatch. So, evolution has come up with these beautiful systems. Like you look at everything, the stress response, the immune response, the immune response in the gut, the way we respond to food. It's evolved over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, even pre-human, for the arrival of humans. And everything was totally matched, because it was totally adapted, it was stored in our genes. Sort of a very conservative storage mechanism, doesn't change that quickly. And then what happened in the last 100 years, in unprecedented speed, the environment has changed, and this mismatch started between the evolutionary wisdom, of our sort of anciently programmed systems and this new world. And it's still ongoing. That there's no sign there's going to be any slowdown anytime soon. I mean, you see a few places, and there's still a few places left in the world, like these natives that I was fortunate to be able to visit, early in my career. The Yanomami living on the Upper Orinoco River, and the Hastas in East Africa, and these huge survivors of that. I mean, there's not many left of these Yanomamis because now they all get sick as well because they've adapted to the Western lifestyle. So probably 20 years, nobody's left where there's this synchronicity between how nature anticipated us to be and what is happening now. And so, for me personally, that is the biggest problem. And inflammation, low-grade immune activation is sort of the main signal of that.
And speaking to your mention of native tribal people who are continuing to live a more authentic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle, there was a study that came out actually quite recently. I think it was August of this year. It was certainly this summer or later, where they looked at 3,000 people, some of them in Italy and other industrialized countries, and they compared them to the Semain that are in the Bolivian Amazon. And they also compared them to, I forget the name, I couldn't pronounce it, but it was a tribal people that live in Malaysia. And what was interesting was that they looked at inflammatory markers, because there's been this idea of inflammaging, that inflammation isn't just causing disease, inflammation is also us and our aging. And what they found is that in industrialized countries, and this is well established, as people get older, the inflammatory markers go up. But what was unique and different is that when they looked at those tribal populations, that actually was not true.
Mhm.
And that you could get older and not have an increase in inflammation.
Mhm.
And when they've looked under the hood, and you were alluding to this, that when they've looked under the hood in separate studies of these exact same people that I'm describing, their microbiome is far more diverse than in Western microbiome.
Yeah, coming back to this, so Maria Gloria Dominguez, famous microbiome researcher and ecologist, so she went to these, like, I think it was 10 or 15 years after we'd been there, to this Yanomami, and collected their stool samples. I don't know how they did this, how they convinced these people that to me seemed like from Mars, because such a completely different behavior from ours. So anyway, they did, and they analyzed their stool microbiome, and it turned out they had the most diverse and richest microbiome of anybody ever studied. And there's also this myth. I mean, there's a lot of these myths that we've come up with in Western society, Western medicine. Well, they have this low life expectancy, the Yanomami. Well, yeah, if you look at how many people get bitten by a crocodile or a snake or a poisonous spider, yes, a lot of people die at a young age.
Right.
But the ones that live longer, they live into your 80s and 90s,
Right.
without any medication.
Right.
So longevity is part of their lifestyle and their whole makeup. To say this to me, I don't want to spend all this time talking about the Yanomami, even though I love it.
Well, it's an interesting case study.
It's an interesting case study. What happened during the pandemic? There were reports what happened to them. So they live in Brazil side of the rainforest, and on the Venezuelan side, and we were on the Venezuelan side, and they basically become like a Medicaid population. They abandoned the way they lived, the huts they built, entire lifestyle is completely disappeared.
Yeah.
And develop all these illnesses,
right,
like skin diseases, and it's really sad that, so like in my lifetime, they have gone from a completely healthy, super healthy example of a perfect match of our exposomes, the world around us, and their own health, to being worse off than a lot of people in the Western world are. I mean, that's the sad part.
Yeah, well, and they've shown, for example, they've had studies where they take a person who comes from the tribal culture and moves to the States, or they look at immigration to the United States, and people lose like very rapidly 30% of their gut diversity upon arrival, and like not even the complete adoption of the American lifestyle.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting topic, and I think there's something to be said that like there's a part of human nature that is going to follow the path of least resistance. Right. So if you allow people to work less, instinctually, they will choose to work less. If you make food more accessible, then they don't have to work so hard for their food. If you give them a home with air conditioning, they're a lot more comfortable. They're going to accept that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But then the problem is we do in a way pay a price for all that.
Yeah. So I just want to come back to this topic of inflammations. You mentioned you're a gastroenterologist. You see a lot of patients with inflammatory bowel diseases, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. That kind of inflammation, I mean, these are chronic, classic inflammatory diseases. You take a biopsy, you don't even have to take a biopsy, do an endoscopy, you see it, like all the hallmarks. But if you take all these other categories of people with inflammatory conditions, you don't see that in the gut, even though we talk about, this inappropriate activation of the gut's immune system. So can you explain that? So you go from one example, which makes a lot of intuitive sense, to say, I can imagine that somebody who has a totally inflamed gut or colon, that they feel fatigued because all these inflammatory mediators get to the brain. Mm-hmm. But what about these other conditions where you don't see anything?
Right. Yeah. So, well, first of all, something that's interesting about inflammatory bowel disease, and I'll be curious if you disagree, that's okay. So I'd be curious what you think about this, but I actually don't think that ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease are autoimmune. I actually think that what's happened is that from birth, our immune system is supposed to be trained to be tolerant of our microbiome and to acknowledge and accept that that's our normal. And if you disrupt that training, you create an immune system that's confused, and confusion in the immune system could manifest with allergic disease, where it attacks something from the outside, like food or whatever, pollen. It can manifest with autoimmune disease where it attacks your own body. But we don't have an antibody in these health conditions that explains that it would be attacking a specific part of the colon. What we do have is we have antibodies to microbes. I think what's happened is the immune system has turned on the microbiome, and the problem is that the lining of the colon is in between. And so the colon, or in the case of Crohn's disease, different parts of the intestine, they become inflamed, and it's just stuck in the middle. And it's showing you what the consequences of an active immune system are, because the immune system's not actually trying to kill those cells, right? It's just showing you what the fallout is.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I would say, I mean, there's also these examples of relatives, asymptomatic relatives of people with I think it was Crohn's disease also. Yeah, I think it was Crohn's disease. They had the microbial alterations that their affected, relatives had. So clearly the microbes play a different role in this. And this early learning phase of the immune system, where the microbes are the kind of the teachers, or the other players that contribute to this developing this expertise of the immune system, play a big role. So no, I would agree with this. I think it's
so. And then with regard to your question, how does this work? So I'll share the thesis from my perspective, and I'll try to also unpack some of the nuance that exists, because it's not so simple. But the thesis is that, much like the brain and the gut, and your research has shown us during the course of your entire career, the brain and the gut are inseparable. They're so intertwined, right? Through many ways, through many different connections. What I have discovered in researching this book is the same is also true of the gut microbiome and the immune system, and what is in between those two entities, which is the gut barrier. So it turns out that 70% of our immune cells are housed in the lining of our intestine. And our gut microbes, they serve many different purposes, but one of the most, perhaps the most important, is that they are the stewards of our gut lining. So our entire intestine, which is 20 to 25 feet long, is carpeted with a single layer of what you and I, and being medical doctors and nerds, would describe as epithelial cells. And that's just a single layer of cells that are held together by proteins called tight junctions. And those cells are replaced more quickly than any other cells in our body. So every 3 to 5 days, we actually replace our gut lining. And to me, this is perhaps the largest immune organ that we have, because that layer of cells, when it's intact and strongly held together, it protects our immune system. And when the immune system is protected and safe, it can be organized. It doesn't need to get activated. And when there is a real threat, it will respond. But the opposite is what's happening in America right now, which is that when you have a dysbiotic microbiome, meaning that the microbiome is out of balance and there's less beneficial bacteria and there's more pathogens, when you have that, the microbiome is not capable, because it's sick. It's not capable of doing its job of maintaining the gut barrier. So that suffers. And when the gut barrier is not well, then you get increased intestinal permeability, where things can sneak across. And this, in common language, is leaky gut. And I actually don't think that there's a problem with that language, because that's actually what's happening. And there are pathogenic bacteria like E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, that they have the capacity to get across that gut barrier. And when they do, they come into contact with the immune system. And the immune system, you mentioned a moment ago that all this is evolved. I would actually argue that our immune system started evolving 1 billion years ago, way before humans existed. Because these microbes developed a coat of armor called lipopolysaccharide. And we have a part of our immune system called the innate immune system. And the innate immune system, we're born with it. And that is actually a gift that we received from evolution, where it's pre-programmed to know what a bad guy is.
Mhm.
And according to, this part of our immune system, the bad guy is lipopolysaccharide. Like that is what it looks for. It recognizes that as that means that it needs to be attacked. So if the gut barrier is weak, then this lipopolysaccharide from these bacteria can sneak across, and that causes activation of the immune system. And that activation, as we've discussed, is inflammation. And so that's not an infection, right? You're not going to get a fever from this, although it could lead to an infection potentially. But in the majority of cases, it's the activation of the immune system, and that activation can have systemic effects. So it could affect our entire body. And that's not to say that the gut is the only thing that matters to the manifestation of disease. That is not my argument. But if you activate the immune system within a certain context of a genetic risk, this is how we ultimately will manifest disease. And it could be different things throughout the body, right? So in the brain, some of your areas of study, it's taken us a while to come to this, to accept that Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, major depression, they carry a common cause, which is neuroinflammation, right? Different manifestations of the same source. And inflammation could have, similar consequences in other parts of our body. In our liver, that's hepatitis.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, this is sort of, partly a debate format. So I partly disagree with that barrier concept in the details, because I sort of, and that's clearly a hypothesis at this point, putting more emphasis on the mucus layer that separates, what do you call the barrier, the epithelial barrier. There's some of these immune cells, the dendritic cells, that stick their sensors into this mucus layer. And if the mucus layer gets compromised, is too thin, then you have contact of even beneficial microbes or non-harmful microbes with these sensors, and the sensors ring the alarm bells on the other side of the epithelium and stimulate cytokine production, and then gets this whole. So I think there's something before the gut gets leaky, which is more like a communication problem, not a mechanical, physical, holes in the gut. I think there's, we can't prove this in humans, but I think in some animal models, there's definitely evidence to suggest that it's not that you go from a normal gut all of a sudden to a gut that has holes in it, which it may have in inflammatory bowel disease, throughout the inflamed area. But I think in these earlier stages of these non-infectious diseases, non-infectious immune-mediated diseases, the mucus layer, the compromised mucus layer, probably plays an equally important role as the actual mechanical barrier.
Yeah. And well, so if it's okay, I'll build upon that. So I think that I agree with you. And there's obviously complexity to it all, right? And what I have said and what you have said can both be true. And it actually is part of the same package. And the mucus layer, so just to define this for everyone at home, because these are things that you and I know, but this single layer of cells, the epithelial layer, does have this mucus layer, which is like almost like a gelatinous substance. And in that mucus layer, there's a microbiome, and there are also things like bacteriocins that are basically defending and protecting from the ability to cross. So it is an oversimplification, to your point, to say that it's just the single layer of cells. Clearly, there's more to it. That being said, the mucus layer, what makes it thick is fiber and short-chain fatty acids. And when you deprive the microbiome of fiber, then they don't have what they need to create short-chain fatty acids, and that ultimately results in thinning out of the mucus layer. So it actually becomes this common source. The short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate, become the common source of both thickness to the mucus layer, but simultaneously the tight junction proteins. And I do think that so I agree with what you said. I think it's part of the same syndrome. same sort of complex.
Yeah.
And also, just to be clear, the idea of increased intestinal permeability is not a black and white thing. These are shades of gray. So meaning that I think that there's like different levels to how far it goes. And what's totally clear is that if you allow lipopolysaccharide across the barrier, the immune system will react. There's no.
Sometimes I think it's a situation, where I think we pretty much know the culprits, the key mechanisms that underlie these chronic diseases. I mean, the story is almost too simple. I mean, I've always, like, as a scientist, you kind of refuse to say there's one cause for all these chronic diseases. I mean, I would better say there's one common major risk factor. It's not the single cause, but
Of course.
so you could almost say we don't need any more science to make people healthier. This whole, Make America Healthy Again movement, really, which I think is a great thing by definition, and there's good parts in it.
Assuming they actually take action and do something.
Yeah, it's not maybe not the right people that are behind it, but so I often think about, you wouldn't need any of this ever more sophisticated science that we're doing to pin it down to molecules, and because we pretty much know the mechanisms, and we know what foods drive primarily or are protective against these mechanisms, which foods drive these compromised barrier system. I mean, do you agree with this? I mean, what do you think science is going to contribute just to making America healthy again? I mean, what do you think we need science?
Well, I don't want science to ever stop. I think there's a lot that is unexplained, and clearly the things that we know today are the result of science allowing us, right? And who knows what is undiscovered or unexplored, right? There's always things, right? When I went to medical school, we didn't have a test that allowed us to define the gut microbiome because they're mostly anaerobic bacteria.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until 2005, 2006 that we discovered that technology that actually allows you and I to sit here today and have this conversation.
Yeah.
So if science had gone paused in the year 2000, we wouldn't be able to do that. But that being said, science can, create complexity to our understanding, but actually, in many cases, the solutions are quite simple. And I think that's really important for us to know that I don't think we need complex blood work. I don't think that we need peptides or could they add value? Of course they could. Could new drug development add value? Of course it could. But that's also us continuing down a path where we're looking for solutions that mostly reduce symptoms and don't help us to address how we got there in the first place. And I think that ultimately we need to address how we got into these things in the first place. And this is not to say that a person it's their fault. I'm not saying that. These are complex things. There's things that you have no control over. There's your genetic profile. There's things that happen during your childhood, right? You can't control if you received antibiotics, you had an ear infection when you're 9 months old. But that being said, we can control our lives beginning today and moving forward. And there's a tremendous opportunity there. And the choices that we make, it doesn't have to be micromanaged. It really is on some level getting back to wholesome food, just natural food, and reorienting our lifestyle towards where we came from.
Mm.
So, spending time outdoors and spending time connecting with other people. And a big part of what I try to do in this book is to go out and look at the world, because I'm not arguing that we should return to being cave people, because cave people didn't have air-conditioned homes or smartphones or cars, right? So what we need to figure out, within an industrial world that we're not giving up, what are the choices that we can make that will make us healthy and thriving? And there are places that we could look, places that you've been to in Europe, specifically in the Mediterranean, or in those places that we can look historically in Japan, or in Loma Linda, California, that there's a story.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, two things. One, I want to make a disclaimer. I'm definitely not somebody who's saying we don't need science. I'm
I know you want it. You're a scientist.
I've spent my entire life doing science, and it's sad to see what's happening. The mistrust of science that has evolved. It's terrible.
That's an entire topic of its own. I feel like a little bit people have made. There's people within who at least are thought to represent the scientific community that have made some really poor choices.
Yeah.
And have eroded public trust.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the second point was, like you mentioned, there's different regions in the world. I mean, I was fortunate to, 3 film expeditions when I was in college to these primal people, in different parts of the world, from Asia to South America and to Africa. But there's other populations closer to home. Like there's, like you go to Italy, and I always use that example. It's one of our favorite travel destinations, usually combined with some aspect of exploring Mediterranean health promoting things. And the biggest surprise to me has been, I was speaking at a conference in Parma. Everybody knows Parma, Parmigiano, and this was the annual meeting of the European Nutritional Society. Parma is a World Heritage Site for nutrition. And the most amazing experience was that we could not find a restaurant where we would get real Mediterranean dishes. There was virtually no salad on the menu.
Wow.
It was always pasta. The appetizer was a big plate of ham and cheese. And I just couldn't believe this. And then, I looked up the statistics on life expectancy and compared it to other places where, there's definitely the classic Mediterranean diet, Sicily and central Italy, this Marche region, and the life expectancy is the same. But one thing we did notice, every place in Italy we went to, the lifestyle was the same. The close social interactions,
yep.
Of eating is always a social event. It's never something that you grab a hamburger in the car or something, or like what we always exposed to these teaching conferences where you grab something and then while you're listening to look at some of the most horrendous images, like you eat your hamburger and drink your Coke. So, I mean, I was curious about your view on this. I've asked that question a lot of people. Is the Mediterranean diet really more the lifestyle, or is it the ingredients in the diet?
Well, there was a study that was done. Actually, I would argue this is one of the top nutrition studies of the last 25 years, called PREDIMED. Mm-hmm. And it was conducted in Spain, funded by the Spanish government. And the question that they were attempting to address is, what is the role of fat in our diet? Because what we had heard in the 80s and 90s is that fat is inherently bad.
This episode is brought to you by Mayer Nutrition. We'll be right back to the episode, but I want to take a quick pause to share something I'm truly excited about. As many of you know, my research has long focused on the brain-gut microbiome system. One of the areas I have been particularly fascinated by is polyphenols and how these magic molecules interact with this system. Polyphenols are compounds found in all plant foods and are especially abundant in blueberries, pomegranates, and grapes. While they are a key component for plants to aid in preventing and treating diseases, when we eat them, they play a similar role in our bodies. Once eaten, these compounds are transformed by our gut microbes into active molecules. These molecules then travel throughout the body, supporting brain function, improving cardiovascular health, helping balance your gut microbiome, and increasing energy. That's why, together with my son Dylan, we created Mayer Nutrition and launched our flagship product, Synaptic Bloom. Synaptic Bloom is a high-potency quercetin blend that contains a diverse spectrum of supporting polyphenols designed to give you the daily diversity most people miss in their diet. According to the CDC, 90% of Americans do not eat enough fruits and vegetables and are likely missing out on the amount and variety of these compounds for optimal health. It's an easy way to support your brain, heart, gut, and your long-term health. You can learn more at mayernutrition.com and use the code MINDGUT for 10% off your first order. I leave the link in the description. Now back to the episode.
So, Emeran, in this study where there are 7,500 people, 5 years, and they're following either a Mediterranean pattern with extra virgin olive oil, Mediterranean pattern with nuts, or a low-fat diet, what they found, first of all, the population they recruited was an older population that was at risk for heart disease, but had not yet had a heart attack or something like this. And what they found was that on the Mediterranean diet, people were at decreased risk for basically the combination outcome of having a heart attack, having a stroke, or death. So the Mediterranean diet was actually like protecting them relative to the low-fat diet. But the interesting part, that's a cardiovascular disease story, right? So if you're a cardiologist, that would be justification to recommend that diet. There were other findings too with diabetes, cholesterol, blood pressure, but specifically to inflammation, they looked at the C-reactive protein, and the Mediterranean dietary patterns, both of them, substantially reduced the C-reactive protein relative to the other. So that's without changing your exercise or your or like specific lifestyle patterns. I do believe that what you're touching on though is extremely important, because we many times will, at least I'm guilty of making it sound like diet is the story. And in fact, I think that there's this bigger conversation that needs to happen. You sort of alluded to this when you set up my book, where like loneliness affects, prior to the pandemic, 50% of Americans reported loneliness. And we're not talking about that as much as we're talking about diet.
It's not sexy.
It's not a sexy topic, but yet loneliness through the brain-gut axis, right? If you activate the sympathetic nervous system through the brain, you will ultimately have consequences within the gut,
Absolutely,
which are inflammatory. And here we are, and loneliness is considered to be on par with smoking cigarettes in terms of the risk to our health and how it affects our longevity.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, the publicity this got in scientific circles, the loneliness epidemic by the Surgeon General, the former Surgeon General,
Yep.
But it's totally disappeared in the background. Unless you're a public health expert who studies that, it's not part of the discussion. Certainly not. There's all kinds of recommendations by influencers about the latest longevity supplement and biohacking and all this stuff, which I find amazing that unless you do it for the money, that anybody would actually believe that. But these psychosocial factors, like purpose, loneliness, social interactions, are not mentioned in the main discussion.
Yeah, and they should be, because ultimately getting back to a conversation about where we came from and where we are today, where we came from was tribal people. This is predating the existence of money. The whole concept of materialism and wanting to be rich, it's like a kind of new idea. I mean, I don't mean new, like, thousands of years, but relative to the entirety of human history, the measure of wealth was actually the size of your family, because there was safety. And we evolved within an environment where when we are connected to others, it makes us feel safe. And that allows us to reduce our sympathetic tone and move towards a more vagal parasympathetic activation. But if you isolate a person, they feel unsafe, they feel threatened because of those origins. And that is just how we end up in sympathetic overdrive, which has consequences.
Yeah, and cooking played a major role in these social interactions. So before cooking, people wouldn't sit around the fireplace. They would hunt, but they would not necessarily have this social cohesion that came with cooking. And I mean, I hate to come back to the Yanomamis, because they have the reputation that there's a book out by a French anthropologist
who calls them the most violent people on the planet, which is the most ridiculous thing, that once you live with them and you see this, how the fathers play with their children, for hours in the hammock playing around, and how the pet birds and pet monkeys that they have with it, they play with them. I don't think any Western family has that amount of spare time to interact, socially. And then when they eat or when they have a celebration. So this is a fundamental concept. And I love that you bring up this sympathetic tone concept, which is, has been one of our most recent areas of interest, because you can measure this even. So typically in physiology, as you know, we do stress tests, and then you measure, norepinephrine increase or heart rate variability. But you can measure a gene expression phenomenon of the CREB. It's called the CREB gene, which is basically a reflection of how much the sympathetic nervous system is engaged without any noticeable. So you could say, if you have 100 people in this city, in 30 of them, you will find this marker, this increased stress responsiveness, without any symptoms at all. But it means that stress system is turned on based on, this could be, the loneliness or the stress, the work or the driving, could be any of these things. And there's certain risk factors for this. And this also influences how your gut functions, because the influence goes down to your gut, even your microbes. Your microbial behavior is altered by this sympathetic influence. And I sort of like, this conversation with you, because you're not just a fiber guy, as kind of you call yourself. You're actually somebody who sees the whole picture, which is a much bigger picture. And I think we gradually, there's a phenomenon, there's a discipline in biology called systems biology, where you assess all the different factors that contribute to a particular outcome. And each of these factors by itself may just contribute 5% of the influence or the variance, or 10%, but it's the various combinations of these influences that ultimately determine the outcome.
Yeah.
Diet definitely plays a big role in it, in throughout, but these other things are modulating factors.
Oh, 100%. And I think that the interesting thing from my perspective is that the gut microbiome tells the story, right? That it's an undeniable story of all of these different environmental influences, the way in which you have lived your life from birth up to today. In fact, even, I would argue, some of the characteristics of your mom during pregnancy actually are part of this story, which manifests in the gut microbiome as it currently stands. And so I think that we need this broader view of our life and those different influences, because they all ultimately do impact the microbiome. And the entire concept of studying disease as a disease state, or studying systems, particular parts of our body, those are really just the result of our limitations as humans. It's an academic exercise for you and I to become gastroenterologists, because we're not smart enough, frankly, to handle being an expert on gastroenterology as well as cardiology, and a surgeon. And we can't do all those things, right? But the body doesn't care, because the body is one. And that body, there's microphysiology that's occurring by the fraction of a second inside of us that's determining certain things that are happening there locally. It's all adding up into who you are. And it also is not separate from your environment. Your environment is impacting who you are in a very powerful way.
So this goes to the fact, so like in our research and many other, people that study complex interactions between different organs. So nowadays we have these massive amounts of data sets, way too big for anybody to understand, where we do these still simplistic statistical analyses, which, are sort of falling by the wayside now, because this. So do you think that AI is one way that ultimately we can integrate all these different influences in a way that, has has a practical consequence, so much better than a physician.
Yeah. So I think the answer is yes, but in order for us to get there, we're only as good as our data and the accuracy of our data. So the challenge is that you need all of these different data points that include what's happening inside the body, what does the blood work show, what are the vital signs, how does the person feel, and it needs to be contextualized for that particular moment. So you can't have blood work from one day and then there's symptoms from another day. And you also can't afford to have inaccurate diagnoses or inaccurate information, because that's basically going to dilute out the effect. So ultimately the answer is yes, but the reason why AI works so powerfully and quickly when it comes to human language is we have writing. So that's tons of data. Every single word is a data point. But what we miss in health, and I know this, as you know, I'm the U.S. medical director of Zoe. So we have the world's largest database of microbiome specimens. We have 300,000 microbiome specimens. But what I see as the limitation is that's great, but you need all of the additional surrounding information in order to be able to interpret it. Otherwise, you can't properly contextualize what you're even looking at. So ultimately, for AI to be successful, we need high quality information, and it's going to be a challenge to get that, because even if you tapped into all health systems in America and allowed us to have all that information, I think that that would be a start, but you still would need to be able to contextualize the data.
So nothing in the immediate future
for health.
Yeah.
Small steps are starting today, for sure. There was a study. Here's a quick example. There was a study that just came out and just this week, where they looked at it was over 1,000 specific chemicals that are found either in our food system or at least in consumer goods, and humans are being exposed to them. And these are things that have been approved as generally recognized as safe. So they're out there. We're all actively being exposed to these 1,000 different things. And they took and used a microbiome model, and they used machine learning, which is just another way of saying artificial intelligence. And they looked at the impact on the microbes, and they found there were 168 that were having a harmful effect on the microbiome. So this tool, artificial intelligence within this setting, has helped us to identify some potential problems. We need follow-up study to verify that. That by itself is not adequate, right? So it's a tool that's helped us in our understanding. But in theory, you could take that artificial intelligence tool and start to apply it beyond this just 1,000, start to apply it to other chemicals to assess their safety within the context of the microbiome. Because one of the major problems that we have, and I'm sure you would agree with me on this, is that we're very quick to approve things and allow them into our environment, into our food system and whatnot, into, consumer goods like makeup and things like this. We're very quick to allow those things in. We're not thoroughly vetting them. And there's no microbiome testing to be heard of. So if we think the microbiome is important, which I certainly believe that it is, I've basically, planted a flag in this space. If you believe it's important, then we should be checking the microbiome before we allow things into our system.
Yeah, I think I would totally agree with this. So, there are systems right now, some prominent players in this space of optimal health, a system called Function Health, where you can basically have, I know I think it's 100 parameters that you can have your blood drawn and this being assessed. And I think ultimately they will apply some form of artificial intelligence or machine learning or whatever. So do you think this is a big step forward in that direction?
Well, so democratizing data and collecting that data, much like what we've done with Zoe. If you get enough people to submit their data, then that's the path that you need to fulfill that. But the issue with functional health, as I understand it, is, are they requiring people to do a thorough symptoms-based survey? Are they requiring people to provide health, which could be privacy, there may be privacy issues around these questions. Are they asking people to provide their health related information, including what their medical history is and things of this variety, right? So, and even then, if they did provide that, is it accurate? Because they're like subjectively sharing. So to me, these are parts of the problems that exist, is like the idea of a large data set that has been widely democratized and a lot of people are doing it is the right way, but you also need that surrounding information in order to fully understand it. And having done many studies using survey tools, that if you were to ask an academic, like, what are the questions that are necessary to properly assess, for example, for major depression or something like this, they come back with 18 questions for one health condition, right? So it's not easy to simplify that.
I mean, talking about testing, so, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of talk about inflammatory diets or anti-inflammatory diets. Are there lab tests to actually prove that a diet has an inflammatory effect on you, engages your immune system, other than in allergic conditions? But and is there objective evidence to say there's anti-inflammatory effects measured with with biomarkers?
Yeah. So the concept of measuring inflammation is a complex topic and not so easy, because a classic blood value would be a C-reactive protein. And the problem is it's actually not that perfect of a test. And inflammation isn't always reflected in the C-reactive protein. There are certainly limitations to this. Measuring cytokines, which I know you know what they are, but for the people who are listening at home, it's a little bit of a complex topic. Cytokines are basically information signals between immune cells. So a cytokine is basically where, like, if an immune cell sees a threat, it will release inflammatory cytokines to recruit other immune cells to help fight the threat. Or the opposite could be true as well, where there's some cytokines that are anti-inflammatory and help to cool off the immune system. And those are not readily accessible tests. They're not easy to get access to.
So a lot of the talk, I mean, you could just boil it down to saying any food that leads to an increase in butyrate production is an anti-inflammatory.
Well, I think there's adequate evidence to both laboratory-based, animal-based, and to the extent that we can measure these things, human-based. I think that there's an overwhelming scientific argument that butyrate is anti-inflammatory, that short-chain fatty acids, all three, acetate, propionate, and butyrate, are anti-inflammatory, right? So, and if you believe that to be true, which I certainly do, then, and it's a core principle within the book, then you turn to, okay, so how do we get those? And fiber is the dominant factor, and 95% of America is deficient in fiber. And, plant-based food contains other nutrients like polyphenols that you've talked a lot about, and they're massively beneficial to us. And most people don't realize that those polyphenols, things like quercetin, resveratrol, curcumin, those are big molecules. They're not easily absorbed. The vast majority, 90 to 95%, come into contact with your microbiome, and that's how we ultimately get access to them. And then the microbiome is changed, and it will produce more short-chain fatty acids. There's an efficiency that results from those polyphenols. So there's actually some interesting stuff with extra virgin olive oil and the impact that it has on the microbiome. That's, you could argue, is prebiotic. And same will be true with omega-3 fats. So I think the point, like, to measure inflammation, yeah, I could offer you a quite scientific story or like detailed answer about like postprandial, after a meal, measurement of IL-6 and different cytokines. And that's all complex, right? But ultimately, can we create an anti-inflammatory diet? Well, if 95% of people are deficient in fiber, we have our opportunity. It's right there. And it goes back to the short-chain fatty acids, and it goes back to the mucus layer that you mentioned, and it goes back to the tight junction proteins and the gut lining.
Yeah, and I mean, the number 95% are deficient in fiber intake. The same is true about polyphenols. I mean, like,
Sure.
you would have to eat a significant amount of fruits and vegetables, which the majority of people don't do, and this whole concept of like, you should have, even though it's just based on one, not the greatest study on, that you need to use 35 different types of vegetables or fruits and vegetables in order to have an increase in the microbes that produce butyrate that are beneficial and that generate these anti-inflammatory. The majority of people don't do that.
Yeah.
They may have, green lettuce as their dinner salad, even if they do. But I mean, you really have to be conscious of this and put an effort into it. It's feasible. So we've done it in our family, these 35, we reach that easily now.
Yeah.
But a lot of people either don't have the money to do it, or they don't have the awareness or the knowledge. I think a lot of people are not really.
Yeah, there's definitely a health literacy issue, and there's ways to eat these foods that actually is very cost effective, but it does require us to bring awareness to those particular approaches. So, for example, yes, of course, fruits and vegetables could be consumed fresh, right? And that unfortunately is quite expensive. And but you could also consume frozen. And actually, in some cases, that's even better. Frozen, because they retain the nutrients because they're harvested and then very quickly frozen, as opposed to sitting in your store for a couple weeks. And whole grains and legumes are not really expensive. Legumes are dirt cheap. We go to Costco and we buy black beans, a bag, right? And they're dry. They'll last me for a long time. And a bag of 10 pounds is less than $10. And so,
then people would have the argument, well, that's not really food, beans. Well, I mean, there's a lot of sort of negative prejudice against some of these. I mean, they are the healthiest foods.
That's very disappointing to hear because to me those are microbiome foods.
Yeah.
So the highest fiber, resistant starch content, and there's polyphenols in there too, for sure.
Yeah.
And perhaps not as much as a berry, but they're in there. And then the last thing I'll say is that sprouting. Have you ever tried sprouting?
We haven't tried that.
We got to get you sprouting. So, do you know Doug Evans?
Yeah.
Okay. So Doug Evans, he's a wonderful guy, kind of a maniac. But sprouting, you can take, for example, a half of a cup of lentils that might cost you 25 cents. And in 3 days, using a simple technique that all it requires is water and about 5 minutes of your time per day. In 3 days, that half of a cup will become 8 cups of lentil sprouts that you can actually consume raw. You don't need to cook them. You could cook them. You don't need to though. And you've enhanced the fiber content. You've enhanced the protein content. They actually have less anti-nutrients. There's a number of benefits to these sprouts, and they're not expensive. You just have to learn how to make them.
Yeah, this is definitely going to make it to the top position, to-do list.
Yeah. We'll have to get you set up with Doug. He has like a sprouting kit that you can use. Makes it easy.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, this is something interesting topic. So, both of us, even though we've been trained in traditional medicine and relying on pharmaceuticals, and I'm a strong believer and defender of the benefits of many of these medications, particularly antibiotics, but there's others as well. I would even call antidepressants fall in this category of really saved hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lives, despite all the criticism. But there's one now, the GLP-1 agonists, that has the potential of being a medication that tackles this concept of this non-infectious chronic disease epidemic, because it seems to have effects on all these diseases that are part of this, this epidemic. And they're going to get cheaper. A growing number of people are using them. There's already impacts on all kinds of things like portion sizes in restaurants. And so what is your opinion? So I have sort of two views of this. One is people get off the hook, so they continue down healthy lifestyle and they take the medications.
Right.
The other one is, so if these medications lead you to eating less, then you, overweight and obesity will go down just based on that, on the volume.
Yep.
Unless side effects pop up, the users of these medications don't need somebody who gives them advice, eat less, because they do it, the brain tells them from medications.
Sure.
So what do you think, what is your opinion on this development? It's definitely happening, and it will have massive dimensions.
Well, I wish it wasn't the first line solution. I have quite mixed feelings about them, because for the people who need them, I'm so glad that we have them. And there are people who are obese, morbidly obese. They're suffering. They have chronic health issues as a result of that. And they've tried and they're unable to lose weight. And these drugs offer them an opportunity. And so for those people, I'm so glad that they have them. That being said, I have reservations. And part of this is we don't know long term. I understand 10 years, but we don't really know what happens. So an example from our field is that there was a very long time, Emeran, that we thought that proton pump inhibitors could be taken without any side effects or downside whatsoever. And there started to be these studies that I dismissed in the beginning, saying that proton pump inhibitor use long-term is associated with Alzheimer's disease or with kidney disease or heart disease. And I thought, that's just associations. I don't think there's any merit to it. And a lot of gastroenterologists still feel that way about those topics. But now we actually have a quite clear picture that those drugs are disrupting the microbiome. And actually there are mechanisms through the microbiome that actually could make sense for proton pump inhibitors being associated with an increased risk of those conditions. So my perspective on those drugs is very different today than it was if you would have asked me 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think that we need caution when it comes to any new exciting drug or technology until we have a more clear picture on what are the long-term risks. And there's many other examples that I could give, right?
Antibiotics.
Right? Exactly. So antibiotics, the greatest invention in the history of human health are antibiotics, and we all benefit from the availability, and we should pray that we continue to benefit from those, from their availability, because antibiotic resistance is becoming an increasing problem. But there's also data that a course of antibiotics is associated with a 2 times increased risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease in the next year. And there's a dose response there, where the more times you take the antibiotic, the more likely you are to have this problem. There's very clear data, overwhelming data, where childhood exposure to antibiotics is associated with metabolic issues, with allergic issues, with autoimmune issues in subsequent years. So, so again, I think that these are quite mixed things.
But the same thing could happen with the GLP-1s. In 10 years from now, all of a sudden, something happens. It could be anything from fertility to
100%,
yeah,
or cancer risk,
yeah,
right. And the problem is that the GLP-1 requires a lifelong commitment. So we don't. If you stop the drug, the weight comes back within a year. What I wish, if I had my way, is number one, we would only use these drugs for people that have a metabolic need. So like the majority of them right now, I don't think are people that actually have a metabolic need. I think that they're actually being used for vanity purposes. Number two, we would require people to have counseling and services to support them to ensure proper nutrition, even while taking the drug. Because if you keep the same diet, but you shrink it, it's a setup for nutritional deficiencies, because it was a junk diet to begin with, but now it's even less. So, and number three, we would create a framework that allows us to use these drugs to bridge people to weight loss. And then we would have an approach that we maintain the weight and we take them off the drug. The problem is much like the use of anti-TNF drugs. So you and I come from a field where there's a strong dependence on the use of powerful anti-inflammatory medications like Remicade and Humira. And those drugs have been around for 20 years. And the drug companies are never going to fund a study that allows us to figure out who are the patients that we can stop using the drug.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously the GLP-1s also are a dream come true for the pharmaceutical industry.
It's a perfect setup.
That half of the population will be on lifelong medication.
Exactly.
So, I mean, let's end this conversation there. Seemingly we could go on for quite a while. So if you look in the future and you had this kind of predict what are the three main positive things that are going to happen with our lifestyles and our diet that you see in your career time are realistic, are going to happen? So meaning in the next 20, 30 years, what do you think is actually going to change?
I mean, I think clearly artificial intelligence is changing everything. I'm glad I'm not a radiologist right now. That would be a problem. So, and there's going to be, you can of course focus on the negative there, but I also think you could focus on the positive and all of the wonderful things that are going to come from artificial intelligence. And I think as we do that, we should enhance our ability to develop. Number two would be enhancing our ability to provide personalized care. So one of the things in the author's note of my book is the acknowledgement that I can only write one book. So everyone's going to read the same book. But I want people to understand as they enter into reading this book that you're going to receive that information in a way that's unique to you. So in a way, it can be personalized because an aha moment is individual. So what I hear and what's important to me would be different than what you hear and is important to you. So I think personalized care is really an exciting opportunity for us. But I would also say that those are sexy topics. I pray that we get back to some fundamentals, which are us acknowledging the ways in which technology that we have built has actually been the source of problems for us. And so we can't wait for our government to fix our issues for us. That's like, I really don't believe it's ever going to happen, but certainly you shouldn't wait for it to happen. You should start today. We are the stewards of our own health, of our own body. And we also have the ability to create an environment within our home that's a healing environment. If you allow our culture to pull you, drag you towards whatever is a cultural norm, that's an inflammatory environment. So to me, we have to be prepared to disrupt what society says is normal and instead create our own normal within our home for us and our family.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of saying it. And, it sort of brings us back to where we started with your book, because it's not just about the science in a very easily understandable way presented here, but it's also a lot of these recommendations that everybody can do and pick the ones that are meaningful to you.
Exactly.
So it's not you have to go on this diet, on this kind of diet.
Yeah. I think there's many different paths to health, and I think it's actually quite important that we identify. For some people, if you take a person who's on a Western diet, for them the nutrition section is going to be the most important thing. For others, it's going to be the conversation about trauma and everything in between. So I think there's opportunities for healing that come in many different forms.
Yeah, so I can't recommend it more for anybody interested in health and holistic health, staying healthy and living a long, healthy life, to read the book. Yeah, so thanks, Will, for this great conversation.
Thank you for having me into your home and meeting your beautiful, wonderful family, and also having a chance to be here with you. It's special.
Thanks.